Mornings in Elizabeth's house moved like clockwork. Too perfect, too precise. The silverware gleamed, the garden looked immaculate, and the staff whispered like ghosts. She'd glide through her routine, perfume on her wrist, pearls at her neck, but something inside her felt numb. Even the ticking of the antique clock seemed to mock her. Steady, predictable, merciless. Behind every polite smile, there was silence, and behind that silence, a woman who no longer recognized her own reflection. Her husband, Henri, still read the same newspaper at the same table, his eyes more loyal to the headlines than to her presence. Their conversations had become like old wallpaper, faded, familiar, impossible to peel away. At luncheons, she played her part well, laughing at predictable jokes, exchanging compliments with women who were just as lonely. It was a theater of manners, and Elizabeth, ever the star, performed flawlessly. Yet the applause never came. Sometimes when the sun hit the marble floor just right, she'd catch sight of her younger self in the reflection, vibrant, spontaneous, full of laughter that used to fill this house. That ghostly glimpse hurt more than she admitted. Beauty had stayed, but meaning had left long ago. Her world was a gallery of stillness, elegant, lifeless, and utterly quiet, until the day a new face entered her daughter's life, and unknowingly, her own. Paul arrived one Tuesday morning, all easy smiles and youthful confidence, his presence too bright for the still air of that house. He was supposed to train Camille, Elizabeth's daughter, the very image of vitality and ambition. From the hallway, Elizabeth watched him greet her family as though sunlight had stepped into the room. She told herself she was only curious, perhaps even protective, but curiosity has a way of becoming something else when it meets loneliness. He wasn't like the others who passed through her home, polite, deferential, invisible. Paul's energy carried warmth, not duty. When he spoke, he looked people in the eye, as if their words mattered. Elizabeth hadn't felt seen in years. Not truly. His laughter filled spaces that had long been empty. She told herself it was nothing, just youth, radiating without intention. Yet a small part of her, the part she'd buried under years of control, stirred awake. Days passed, and she found herself adjusting her routine without meaning to. She lingered longer at breakfast, rearranged her schedule to coincide with Camille's sessions, even invented reasons to pass through the garden while he worked. It was absurd. She knew that. A woman of her age, her standing, shouldn't feel her pulse quicken over a man so young. Still, each glance carried a strange electricity, like a spark flickering in a room she thought had gone dark forever. It happened so quickly she almost missed it. A compliment, simple, sincere, slipped from Paul's lips as he helped her adjust a scarf she hadn't realized had come loose. "You have such a graceful way about you," he said, not flirtatious, not calculated, just real. For a heartbeat, Elizabeth forgot to breathe. No one had spoken to her like that in years, not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a woman. Something fragile and forgotten fluttered inside her chest. That night, she stood before her mirror longer than usual. The face staring back wasn't young, but it was still beautiful, lined by time, yet dignified. She touched her collarbone, remembering the warmth of his hand brushing past it, purely accidental, yet impossible to dismiss. It wasn't love. It wasn't even attraction. Not yet. It was recognition, of being seen, of being alive. And once the heart tastes that again, it doesn't easily return to sleep. The next morning, she woke before dawn, restless, alert. The house felt different, or maybe she did. The ticking clock no longer mocked. It whispered. She moved through her rituals with purpose, as though something invisible had been set in motion. Elizabeth didn't understand what was changing, only that it was. Somewhere deep inside, she sensed that the stillness of her life had been broken, and that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever return to how it was. Elizabeth began to crave their moments together, the sound of his voice, the calm way he said her name, the rare sense of being truly seen. Each meeting left her with a strange ache, half joy, half fear. She'd return to her house, walk through its pristine rooms, and feel the walls closing in, pressing against her chest. The dinners with Henri became unbearable, each polite conversation a rehearsal in pretending. She had discovered something intoxicating, a secret aliveness that no one could take from her. Paul sensed it too, though he fought it in silence. At night, he'd lie awake replaying their talks, wondering when his thoughts of her had crossed from respect to longing. She was older, elegant, unreachable, everything he'd been taught not to desire. Yet there was warmth in her sadness, something magnetic in the way she carried her pain with grace. He told himself it was admiration, nothing more. But admiration has a way of turning into fire when left unattended. By now, they both knew what they were doing, pretending not to notice the current pulling them closer. Every look lingered a little too long. Every word carried hidden meaning. The air between them had grown heavier, almost alive. Camille laughed beside them, oblivious, while Elizabeth's pulse drummed like a secret inside her wrist. She didn't want him, and yet, somewhere deep inside, she already did. The night it happened, rain was pouring down like confession. Elizabeth had offered to drop off some papers Camille had forgotten at Paul's apartment, a harmless errand, an excuse she barely believed herself. The city was quiet, washed in silver light, and her hands trembled on the steering wheel as though her body already knew what her mind refused to name. When he opened the door, barefoot, hair damp, t-shirt clinging to his chest, something inside her broke free. She wasn't sure if she was terrified or alive. Paul smiled, surprised to see her there. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said, but his voice carried something softer, gratitude, maybe curiosity. She handed him the envelope, their fingers brushing in that small, dangerous space between accident and intent. The air was thick with things unsaid. They talked for a while. About nothing. About everything, the rain filling every silence. It wasn't planned. It never is. But sometimes life waits for a storm to make us honest. When she finally stood to leave, he walked her to the door. The lights flickered, the air smelled of wet asphalt and coffee, and for a second, neither of them moved. Then it happened. The look, the pull, the surrender. His hand rose to her face as if drawn by instinct. Hers found his arm, and suddenly the world tilted. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but behind it was everything they'd been denying. Years of loneliness collapsed into one heartbeat. The moment ended, but the silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth stepped back, breathless, her hand trembling against her lips as if to hold the memory in place. She wanted to apologize, to escape, but the truth had already crossed the threshold. Paul stood before her, equally shaken, his chest rising and falling like a confession he couldn't speak. For a second, neither was young or old, right or wrong, just human, raw, stripped of every mask. He whispered her name, and it was enough to undo her again. When he reached for her, she didn't resist. The kiss deepened, the world dissolving around them, rain against the windows, heartbeat against heartbeat. There was no plan, no promise, only instinct. For the first time in years, she felt warmth not out of duty, but desire. It was terrifying. It was divine. She knew she would regret it. And yet, in that moment, she couldn't imagine not having it. Hours later, when she finally left, the streets felt both foreign and familiar. Her reflection in the car window startled her. Eyes bright, lips swollen, skin alive. She'd crossed a line she could never uncross. But she couldn't bring herself to feel sorry. At home, the house seemed smaller, quieter, almost judgmental. She stood before her mirror again, seeing not the wife, not the mother, but the woman beneath it all, trembling, reborn, and terrified of the truth that awaited the morning. The days that followed were electric, each one a careful dance between desire and discretion. Elizabeth found herself inventing errands, adjusting schedules, and lingering in places she never would have before, all just for another glimpse, another word, another touch. Every stolen text or glance felt like a small rebellion, a declaration she hadn't dared voice aloud. She knew she was treading a line that could shatter everything, and yet the thought of stepping back was unbearable. Paul was no less consumed. Every conversation, every shared smile carried weight now, each charged with possibilities neither dared to name. He kept his apartment simple, modest, yet it had become a haven, a world separate from judgment, expectation, and routine. When Elizabeth arrived, the air seemed to hum with what was forbidden but inevitable. They both understood that what had started as curiosity had morphed into something neither could control and neither wanted to. Even in the quiet moments, guilt and thrill intertwined. Elizabeth would return home, slip through the polished halls, and hear Henri's voice in the distance, thinking of what she had done. The house felt colder now, not because of its design, but because she had awakened to something she could not ignore. Paul lingered in her mind like a half-remembered dream, impossible to shake, impossible to resist. Their affair had begun, secret, thrilling, and poised to change everything. Seaside weekends became their secret ritual, a brief escape from the polished life that waited at home. Elizabeth felt lighter there, unshackled from expectation, free to laugh, to breathe, to simply be. Paul walked beside her on wet sand, fingers brushing against hers in casual defiance of the world. They shared long conversations about dreams once abandoned and fears never spoken. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, vast and merciless, yet comforting, as if it understood the risks they were taking. Back in town, the rhythm of deception grew heavier. Elizabeth began inventing excuses for missed dinners, social gatherings, and family events. She smiled at Henri, but the warmth was mechanical, rehearsed. Every interaction carried an undercurrent of guilt, and yet the pull of her secret life was irresistible. With Paul, she laughed freely, even flirted with danger in her thoughts, knowing that one misstep could unravel the delicate threads holding her two worlds together. Paul struggled too, caught between longing and conscience. He loved her, that much was clear, yet the outside world was relentless in its judgment, and he feared the consequences. Their differences, age, social standing, and life experience, loomed larger with each encounter. Still, when he looked at Elizabeth, none of it seemed to matter. In her presence, the only reality was the heat of their stolen moments and the quiet certainty that they were both changing, whether the world allowed it or not. Perfect. Continuing with Chapter 4, Block 2, 3 paragraphs, 6 lines each. Tone, tension, guilt, and the intoxicating pull of forbidden love, showing the affair's emotional and practical consequences. Elizabeth's home life began to fray in subtle, almost invisible ways. Henri noticed her distracted glances, the quiet sighs she thought he wouldn't hear. Family dinners grew tense, conversations shallow. Camille remained blissfully unaware, laughing at jokes that now felt hollow to Elizabeth. Every moment with Paul was a reprieve, a stolen breath of air in a room closing in, and yet that very sweetness carried a sting, the realization that her desire was exacting a toll she couldn't ignore. Even Paul felt the pressure. His eyes darkened at times, shadowed with guilt and worry. He loved her, yes, but love in their world was a complicated, treacherous thing. Every rendezvous carried the weight of discovery. Every text, every call, a potential spark in the dry tinder of Elizabeth's life. And yet, despite the fear, despite the danger, neither could resist. They both knew the consequences, and yet they indulged anyway, because what they shared was rare, intoxicating, and undeniable. Their weekends by the sea became islands of truth in a world of lies. Elizabeth would walk along the shore, Paul close by, feeling the water cool against their feet, listening to the gulls scream above. Each laugh, each touch, each lingering glance reinforced what they already knew. This was no fleeting infatuation. It was real, it was alive, and it was dangerous. The collision between desire and duty loomed ever closer, threatening to crush them, but they clung to one another, tasting freedom where the world offered none. Back in her house, Elizabeth moved through the halls like a ghost, haunted by the contrast between her two lives. The polished floors and gleaming chandeliers felt colder now, almost accusing. She smiled at Henri, laughed at polite conversation, but inside, a storm raged. Every stolen moment with Paul replayed in her mind, his hand brushing hers, the heat of his gaze, the quiet intensity of their laughter. The world outside their bubble was unforgiving, and yet, within it, they were free. Paul's presence lingered in every corner of her consciousness. Even mundane routines, pouring tea, arranging flowers, tidying the garden, carried echoes of him. She found herself imagining his voice, his touch, the way he moved through spaces with effortless confidence. Their affair had shifted from temptation to necessity, a force that reshaped her desires, her thoughts, even her sense of self. The thrill of secrecy intertwined with fear, making every encounter both exhilarating and perilous. Yet the pressure mounted. Henri's suspicions began to surface in subtle remarks, quiet observations that unsettled her. Camille remained innocent, blissfully unaware, while Elizabeth's heart raced at the thought of discovery. Each rendezvous with Paul felt like balancing on the edge of a cliff. The world could crumble at any moment, and yet she could not step back. Desire had become a currency she could not resist spending, even as she sensed the cost mounting with every heartbeat. The secret unraveled one afternoon like a thread pulled too far. Camille had forgotten her phone at home, and a single message from Paul slipped through unnoticed. The truth spilled into sunlight, sharp, and undeniable. Elizabeth felt the walls of her carefully constructed world collapse in an instant. Henri's eyes, full of disbelief and rage, met hers across the table. The home that once felt safe now seemed alien, oppressive, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The confrontation was brutal, honest, and merciless. Words were hurled, accusations, tears, and confessions mixing together in a storm of emotion. Elizabeth's heart raced, guilt gnawing at her like fire. And yet, beneath the chaos, a strange clarity emerged. She was no longer a passive observer in her own life. She had made choices, faced desire, and now had to bear the consequences. Every reprimand, every scornful glance, was a mirror reflecting the woman she had become. Amid the chaos, Paul arrived, breathless, eyes wide with fear and longing. Their hands found each other instinctively, a lifeline in a storm of judgment. Elizabeth realized that the love they shared was imperfect, fragile, yet undeniably real. Leaving meant freedom and loss. Staying meant suffocation and shame. Her gaze swept the room, the home, the family, the life she had once clung to, and for the first time, she made a choice entirely for herself. Elizabeth left that evening, her suitcase light but her heart heavy with everything she couldn't take. The halls she had walked for decades now echoed with absence, a ghostly reminder of the life she had abandoned. Henri's voice lingered, a mixture of anger and disbelief, while Camille's tears burned a trail of guilt across Elizabeth's chest. Each step toward the door felt like shedding skin, leaving behind a version of herself who had played the obedient wife, the dutiful mother. Paul waited in the car, quiet, hands gripping the wheel as if anchoring them both to reality. When she slid beside him, their fingers entwined, the silence said everything. No words could capture the chaos they had left behind. Yet in that moment, it didn't matter. They were together, fragile, imperfect, and free. Elizabeth felt the thrill of autonomy, of choosing passion over convenience, truth over comfort. It was exhilarating and terrifying, a life carved out of courage and desire. As the city lights receded behind them, Elizabeth realized that freedom was not the absence of consequence, but the embrace of consequence. With eyes wide open, she glanced at Paul, heart swelling with a mixture of love, fear, and hope. The world outside would judge them, perhaps even destroy them, yet they carried their own reality in that car, intimate, alive, unrepentant. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt the pulse of life coursing through her veins, undeniable, unbroken, and entirely hers. They found a small coastal town, quiet and removed, where no one knew their names or histories. Their days became simple yet profound, morning walks along the cliffs, evenings filled with shared laughter, and the intimacy of unspoken understanding. Elizabeth discovered a strength she hadn't known existed, a power in claiming her own happiness despite the wreckage left behind. Every stolen glance, every gentle touch from Paul reminded her that desire and truth, though dangerous, were worth the cost. Letters, memories, and familiar streets became relics of a life she once lived, precious yet distant. She thought of Camille, of Henri, and felt a pang of sorrow, but it was tempered by clarity. She had chosen her own path, and that choice, messy as it was, belonged entirely to her. The pain of loss mingled with the exhilaration of freedom, a delicate balance of grief and delight that marked the turning point of her life. As Elizabeth watched the sun dip into the horizon, Paul beside her, she realized that love wasn't about perfection or safety. It was about daring to risk everything for something real, something that made the heart ache and soar in the same breath. Whether their future held permanence or impermanence no longer mattered. She had been reborn, awakened to passion and truth, and in that awakening, she found herself fully, fiercely, and undeniably alive.